Contrary to popular belief, Africa is not poor. You don't go to a poor country to make money. Yet, Shell gets all its oil from Nigeria. France powers all its lights with uranium from Niger. Barrick Gold gets all its gold from Tanzania. And Congo's untapped deposits of raw minerals are estimated to be worth more than 24 trillion US dollars. If these countries are so rich, and everyone seems to be getting their resources from there, then why are the people so poor? This guy had the same question. So did this guy, and this guy, and this guy. Unfortunately, they all met the same fate: death. The real question we should be asking is, why do African leaders keep dying? And more importantly, who's killing them?
This is the special opportunity God has given us. We are supposed to move together. We are supposed to move as Africans. Africa should move on their own.
Making these videos isn't easy, and it's not cheap either. If you like these videos and want us to keep making them, please buy a shirt or a hoodie. We have a lot of cool designs that you might like. Link in the description. Thanks for your support. Now, back to the video. Those are diamonds, one of the most sought-after stones in the world. And when it comes to the value of diamonds, Botswana is the world's top diamond producer. In 2013, they produced 23.2 million carats, worth $3.6 billion. They are producing nearly $4 billion worth of diamonds. Yet, just down the road from this De Beers diamond mine sits a community of impoverished Botswani. They live in makeshift houses and have no electricity or indoor plumbing. So where is all that money going if not there? Well, Botswana only keeps 25% of what's extracted. De Beers, a British company, takes 75%. Similar exploitation is happening in Niger. Since the discovery of uranium in Niger back in the late 50s, the ore has almost exclusively been exported to France by Areva, a French nuclear power company. France basically has a monopoly on Niger's natural resources. But they're not just using Niger to power nuclear weapons, they're using it in the home of every French citizen. 3 out of 4 light bulbs in France are powered by Nigerian uranium. These impoverished Nigerian homes are keeping the lights on for Frenchmen, which is ironic considering that only about 15% of Nigerian urban areas have access to electricity, while only about 2% do in the rural areas. The mining that goes on all across Africa creates massive amounts of waste and destroys the environment. These foreign companies and countries don't seem to care about the health of Africa. They only seem to care about Africa's abundance of natural resources. I mean, Africa is arguably the most resource-rich continent on the planet, full of oil, natural gases, gold, diamonds, wildlife, food. The list goes on. Yet the majority of its people are impoverished, suffering for the benefit of Western and European countries. Unfortunately, this is how Europe and North America wants it to be, and they will literally kill to keep it that way. On the surface, this seems like a classic story of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, which it is. But when you dig deeper, you find the reason for Africa's poverty and massive gap in wealth is a byproduct of hidden wars waged by the CIA, a slew of shadowy assets called economic hitmen, and powerful world elites like Bill Gates and the Rothschilds. And I'm just getting started.
When you provide all the resources, and then somebody comes along and uses specious arguments and deprives you of them, what assurance do we have that tomorrow the powerful among us will not just say, look, we don't want anything to do with Nigeria anymore, and they will actually walk away and we can't stop them? But when we, the small people, want to go away, then they will come and say, look, we have the army. No, sir, I don't accept it.
Say hello to Ken Saro-Wiwa, an Ogani activist who's fed up with the corruption and destruction of Ogoniland by massive oil companies that have been exploiting the area since the 1950s. For this, we can thank Shell. who at one point had the entire Nigerian government paid off.
We are going to demand our rights peacefully, non-violently, and we shall win.
In the 90s, Saro-Wiwa led several protests against the massive oil company. He led marches, sabotaged infrastructure, and intimidated Shell employees. Because of him, Shell was losing out on tons of profit every day. In response, Shell allegedly framed Saro-Wiwa for killing 4 men. He was arrested and later sentenced to death by hanging. Many accused Shell of murder. Many believe that murder is what ended the life of MKO Abiola and John Pombe Magufuli too, despite both their deaths being attributed to heart problems. In the midst of Saro-Wiwa's rebellion, Moshood Kashimawa Alawali Abiola ran for president in Nigeria and won.
I won.
But he was not awarded the title of president. Instead, he was imprisoned and allegedly killed by American delegates. Abiola ran on the slogan, "Farewell to Poverty." He had big ambitions for Nigeria's economic policy. He wanted to negotiate better deals with foreign creditors and cut the country's international debts. Basically, Abiola was Nigeria first, a man of his people, a man not beholden to foreign interests. But America couldn't have that. He was also up against a tyrannical military president who did not want to give up power.
It is true that the presidential election was generally seen to be free, fair, and peaceful. However, there was in fact a huge array of election malpractices virtually in all.
When Abiola won the presidency in a landslide in 1993, he was arrested for treason. Abiola was imprisoned for 4 years, largely trapped in solitary confinement, as the Nigerian government pestered him to renounce his presidential claim. But he refused. Abiola was set on freeing his country from poverty, something he would unfortunately never see come to fruition. Everyone in the country, including American delegates, knew that Abiola was wrongfully imprisoned, but the Americans did basically nothing to help him. In fact, they did the opposite. In 1998, on the day he was due to be released, he died unexpectedly. The whole world was shocked to hear this. And the official story that he died of heart complications just wasn't enough for the Nigerian people. The theory that began circulating was that he was poisoned by the United States government. You see, just before his release, Abiola met for tea with American delegates, whom Nigerian citizens already didn't trust. They met to discuss the country's planned transition to democratic rule. The details of this meeting are unknown. All we know is that this was the last meeting Abiola would ever have, and that the United States benefited from his death. So why would the United States kill Abiola? Well, remember what Abiola ran on: farewell to poverty. The poverty that the United States profits off of. One African journalist wrote that Abiola's killing was America's quest to put a permanent end to the democratic impasse that had seized Nigeria like a pestilence. Damn. To truly understand why the United States wants to keep Africa in poverty, we need to travel to Tanzania and meet Dr. John Pombe Magufuli.
We used to depend on development donors. Now we are constructing some of the roads by using our own budget. So that is something which is very special.
If you're from the West, you probably heard a lot about the anti-vax, COVID-denying, controversial president Magufuli in 2021, after he died from heart complications that most Westerners, due to the shoddy reporting of mainstream media, chalked up to COVID-19. But like most things the mainstream media blindly babbles on about, there is more to the story. President Magufuli had a 96% approval rating in his first year in office. Very controversial. Magufuli was nicknamed the bulldozer for his ability to implement government policy extremely effectively. These policies were aimed at ending poverty in Tanzania and strengthening the economy. The first thing he did when he was elected in 2015 was cut his own salary from $15,000 to $4,000. Magufuli's economic leadership was so effective that by 2020, Tanzania had developed from a low-income country to a middle-income country. Magufuli believed that his country had been cheated out of profit, wealth, and stability, and had been exploited by imperialists since its independence. Now, that tide was turning. His Tanzania First political strategy was working. It was working a little too well. One of the first big points of contention was the attack he made on the Water-Efficient Maize for Africa, or WEMA. Stick with me here, because here's where the connections get weird. WEMA was co-headed by the African Agricultural Technology Foundation, a nonprofit funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, PepsiCo, and the United States Agency for International Development, a long list of powerful entities. And Magufuli was about to make them all very angry. From 2018 to 2021, he issued several presidential acts that made WEMA's job very difficult, like stopping GMO trials that were being conducted on Tanzania's crops. In January of 2021, he announced his plan to protect Tanzania's food sovereignty, a plan that would further cut the profitability of these foreign corporations and countries. Only a month later, the Tanzanian president would disappear. If Magufuli's attack on Bill Gates, Rockefeller, and USAID wasn't enough to raise suspicions about his death, just wait until you hear how he angered some of the biggest moneymakers in the world, the mining and oil industries. In 2017, Magufuli declared economic warfare on foreign mining companies, enacting laws that gave Tanzania a much greater share of the revenue from the natural resources these companies were exporting. These new laws also gave the Tanzanian government the ability to renegotiate or even opt out of existing contracts with companies that had been established before Magufuli's presidency. All of this, of course, came at the expense of the mining companies. The economic war had begun. Maybe the biggest battle in this economic war was between Magufuli, Barrick Gold, and Glencore. In 2018, the two companies, Barrick and Glencore, had joint ownership of the Kabanga Nickel Project, one of the biggest nickel deposits in the world, right here in Tanzania. It's worth noting that in 2018, and still today, nickel is an extremely valuable resource. Without it, we wouldn't have all this next-gen tech and infrastructure we have today, like electric cars, for example. Magufuli knew this and wanted to make sure that the resources benefited Tanzania. Barrick Gold also knew this, and they had plans of their own. Magufuli's plan was twofold. One, he started dishing out billions of dollars in fines to Barrick Gold and other mining companies for unpaid taxes and environmental damages. And two, he revoked Barrick and Glencore's license for the Kabanga Nickel Project, forcing them to miss out on potentially billions of dollars in profit. Angering these companies is a particularly dangerous act, especially when it comes to Glencore. Glencore was originally founded by Mark Rich in 1974, a man who was once on the FBI's most wanted list and an asset for Israel's secret intelligence agency. Today, the company is tied to Nathaniel Rothschild, who owns a $40 million stake in the company and is good friends with Glencore's CEO. The Kabanga Nickel Project continued on without Barrick and Glencore. Instead, Magufuli negotiated with another mining company, giving Tanzania part ownership of the mine, a huge economic boost for the country, a massive slap in the face for Barrick and Glencore.
Harder. 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 Harder.
Magufuli had won the battle, but the war was far from over. In fact, it's still going on today.
Tanzania is in national mourning for the next 2 weeks following the death of President John Magufuli. The late president had downplayed its dangers, previously claiming that Tanzania had defeated the virus through prayer.
Western media's portrayal of Magufuli, although positive in the early stages of his career, quickly developed into an all-out smear campaign, especially during the COVID pandemic, when Magufuli refused to implement any major lockdowns or mask mandates. And when he unexpectedly died in March of 2021, Western media was slow to show empathy. The The main source of mainstream media reporting came from this guy, Tundu Lissu. He was a former Tanzanian lawmaker and Magufuli's most vocal critic at the time. He was also formally employed by the World Resource Institute, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting Earth and improving people's lives by utilizing world resources, like those coming out of Africa. This institute is funded by some of the same entities I mentioned earlier, like Bill Gates, Rockefeller, and Shell, but they're also funded by massive banks and tech companies like Google. A long list of institutions that definitely care about Africa's interests. To make matters worse, Lissu didn't seem too upset about Magufuli's death. He was actually happy about Magufuli's vice president taking over, suggesting she'll take the country in a very different direction, a direction more appealing to the global elites. Unfortunately, we see this trend often. An African leader stands up to the imperialists exploiting their country, meets a less than desirable fate, and is subsequently replaced by a more submissive leader, or replaced with a leader who has more questionable loyalty.
We came, we saw, he died.
Let's leave Tanzania and head over to the Congo. Patrice Lumumba came to power when the Congo gained independence from Belgium in 1960, the middle of the Cold War. Because of the Cold War, his country was very, very important to America, Belgium, and their allies. Why? One reason: uranium, a material that is critical in the creation of nuclear bombs. At this point, you should probably be able to guess how the rest of the story goes. The Belgians, Americans, and their allies needed to control the resource for their own personal agendas, and they would stop at nothing to do just that. Lumumba was very neutral when it came to foreign affairs, a political stance that did not benefit the Belgians or the Americans. So, only a few months after rising to power, Lumumba was assassinated by a Belgian-supported coup, and with the help of the United States CIA, was replaced by a CIA asset, a man whose leadership didn't get in the way of Belgium's and the United States' quest for nuclear power. The deaths of these African leaders each tell a different story, but the process of exploiting a country is always the same. When a first world country identifies a third world country with untapped resources, usually because the country lacks the technical and political power to develop them, the first world country will send in what's called an economic hitman.
I stood in front of the Shah of Iran, presidents of Indonesia, Ecuador, Panama, members of the Royal House of Saudi Arabia, and I've said something like, in this hand, I have millions of dollars for you and your friends if you play our game. In this hand, I have a gun in case you decide not to. Now, my words were more diplomatic than that, but that was the message. I was an economic hitman.
You've almost certainly heard of a hitman, someone paid to kill, an assassin of sorts. An economic hitman is not that different, but instead of killing people directly, they drown their target in debt. These economic hitmen are usually hired through third-party companies which work with government entities or the World Bank. Their job is to go to the target nation and convince their leader to accept large loans, using their country's untapped resources as collateral. Remember that collateral, because that's a very important step in this strategy. These loans are to be used to pay companies in first world countries to build infrastructure for the underdeveloped country. On its surface, this doesn't sound so bad, but that's exactly what the economic hitmen want you to think. Their job is to make the agreement sound appealing and too good to turn down. But what ends up happening is these massive companies in first world countries reap massive profit, and the third world country just suffers, because they're forced to divert funds that would normally go to education, health, and other public sectors to pay interest on these huge loans. And their debt continues to grow until it's unpayable. Remember the resources they deemed as collateral? Well, suddenly the country is defaulting on their loans, and giving away their natural resources for nothing in return. And that is called debt trap diplomacy. So the leader of that country might get a lot of money out of it, but it just further increases the gap between the very rich and the very poor. It doesn't even end at money and resources. Once a country is enslaved by debt, its master may demand other things, like favorable United Nations votes, or the installation of military bases on their homeland. When a leader refuses to work with these economic hitmen, refuses to give in to the first world countries attempting to enslave them, that is when the other type of hitman enters the scene. The brave leaders that traded their lives to uphold the morality knew this would be the case. These developed countries, like the US, the UK, China, Russia, always end up on top, while underdeveloped countries continue to get beat down before they even get a chance to get up.
This was not a conspiracy. It was just like a known thing. And we would shape the economy, usually to do two things in the tropics. We would focus on extractive industries. So like, let's get this stuff out of the ground as fast as possible without any benefits accruing to the local population. In fact, we'd often like ruin the environment around them and, make their life miserable. And number two, agriculture stuff. So we would like force them to do this like monocrop, like kind of industrial scale agriculture that usually of things that they couldn't eat, that they would export to us for our consumption. We would like engineer their society to do this and to be more dependent. In order to do so, this is an export-led model. You want the exports to be cheap, right? So that means you need the currency to be weak. So we would devalue the currency. And you basically want to like shrink the economy. Like you don't want the government to be like providing any subsidies to its people or like healthcare, education. No. That's only for rich countries. Now, of course, the dictator takes his cut.
This sounds unreal, but it's happening all across the globe. African leaders aren't the only ones dying. This also happens in first world countries, when a leader attempts to help a poorer country escape exploitation. Take Sweden's Dag Hammarskjöld, for example. He was extremely outspoken about this very issue, and on his way to Congo in 1961 to mediate the end of a rebellion in the region, his plane mysteriously crashed and he died. Many believe that his plane was attacked by a European mercenary group employed by a Belgian mining company who benefited from the civil war in Congo. I could go on. The list of people who have tried to stop this madness is endless, and almost all of them were assassinated or died under mysterious circumstances following their strong opinions on foreign affairs, opinions that mirrored those of the African leaders I mentioned earlier. So whose fault is this? Who's perpetrating this cycle of country extortion and the death of foreign leaders everywhere? This is the fault of the entangled alliance of governments, the World Bank, and transnational corporations, and the corruption and greed that infects nearly all the world's elite. The fault doesn't fall on one person, rather a small group of people, the minority 0.1% who rule the world. That small pool of people is somehow able to convince the rest of us that the richest continents on the globe are the poorest, and that all these extremely convenient deaths are merely a coincidence. They use the media as a weapon. They turn us against each other and stoke the fire of division, foreign and domestic. Africa is often seen as the poorest place on earth, when in reality, the whole world relies on them. If they could only get the globalist boot off their neck, they would have everything they need to become a major player on the world stage. The global elites want us kept in the dark because it further empowers them. They want the poor to stay poor because it makes them richer. They've been doing this for years, and they'll keep doing it until we wake up, unite, and tell them to end it.